Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Becky Leathersitch. I'm a research instruction librarian, and I'm excited to welcome everyone to today's session titled Teaching Anti-Racism Through Sports History in Jackie Robinson. Today's session is part of Geneseo's month-long celebration honoring Black History Month. As part of our efforts of becoming an anti-racist college, these series of events and sessions planned and organized by the Anti-Racism and DEI Subcommittee of the President's Commission on Diversity and Community will hopefully spark discussions, reflections, and actions as we work towards this vision of anti-racism. The last week of our month-long series, the rest of the events, you can look at them if you click the link that I just put in the chat. Before we begin, we ask our participants that you might mute your microphones during the presentation. We do, however, encourage you to use the chat feature to provide questions for the presenters. We have allotted time at the end for a Q&A session. We ask that all questions and comments are grounded in respect. No disrespect towards the presenter, moderator, or other participants will be tolerated. We reserve the right to remove participants if these expectations are violated. Now let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Justin Behrend, Professor and Department Chair of History, has been on the SUNY Geneseo faculty since 2007. His research interests include 19th century African-American history and Atlantic world slavery. Dr. Behrend is the author of Reconstructing Democracy, Black Grassroots Politics in the Deep South After the Civil War, and he has published articles on slave rebellions, emancipation, and Reconstruction. In this session, Dr. Behrend will discuss his Intersession course, History 430, Jackie Robinson, Baseball, and American Racism. Dr. Behrend is joined by student Julia Holman, who enrolled in the course. Julia is a senior anthropology major and history minor. Together, they will discuss teaching and learning from an anti-racist perspective, as well as the challenges of an intersession course. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Behrend and Julia.
Great. Thank you, Becky, and thank you all for being here on this Monday afternoon in late February. I look forward to sharing a bit with you and hopefully having a dialogue with you towards the end of our time. What I thought I would do is give a bit of a slideshow presentation to kind of talk a little bit about Jackie Robinson. Then I'll lay out some themes that I think that I learned in the process of teaching the course. And then I'm going to turn it over to Julia, who is going to talk about her experience in being a student in the course. And then, that should give us a fair amount of time at the end to kind of talk about, in some ways, anti-racism curriculum, anti-racism courses, things that I'm still thinking through. I haven't exactly clear to me what that means in particular, and there's ways that I think this course meets those objectives, but not necessarily. So that's the plan for today. So let me share my screen here and start by talking a little bit about Jackie Robinson. So as you kind of heard in the introduction from Becky, I'm more of a 19th century historian, but I'm a baseball fan. And I'm a Dodger fan because I'm from Los Angeles. So I've always kind of had a special place in my being for the Dodgers and Jackie Robinson. And I just thought it might be interesting to kind of connect the two in this way. And so this course, this is actually the opening image that I put on the syllabus, partly because of Rachel Robinson, who is there on the left, which is Jackie's wife, who just looks awesome there in the photo. And really, I think one of the themes I wanted to get at in the course is that there's more to this story than just one man. I think Jackie Robinson is worthy of study and worthy of replication, but it's never just one individual. And so while this course, a very short course over a 4-week intersession, having a focus on one individual kind of gave it a good structure and an appropriate focus. One of my challenges was to suggest that it was more than just one individual. And Rachel, of course, who's still alive actually, was key to that, everything that Jackie Robinson accomplished. I think the first thing to kind of think about when we talk about the history of baseball is to recognize that there was the Negro Leagues that preceded the integration of Major League Baseball. The Major League Baseball actually just added the Negro Leagues within the category of a legitimate organizations, but for a long time they were not. They were not as well funded and not as treated as on the same level as the white baseball leagues. But they were very popular at the time, particularly among African Americans. This New York team called the Cubans was done so because it actually employed a lot of Cubans. One thing you find out about the history of baseball is that it's always been transnational. Baseball has this. They like to think about America as the center of the world. That's why there's the World Series. And that's not really true, but it is true that there's a broader reach. And so these Cubans came to the United States, they played. There were Cubans who did play in the major leagues, but they were very light-skinned Cubans. So these darker-skinned Cubans could not. And 1947 was the year that Jackie Robinson broke into baseball. One other point to think about, or two other points to think about with the Negro Leagues is one that the integration of baseball, which Jackie Robinson initiated, destroyed the Negro Leagues. They kind of declined soon thereafter. And this actually meant the loss of a lot of jobs for African Americans and a lot of capital and investment in the Black community. The other thing to consider is that on the table for proposed integration was the idea of actually incorporating these teams into the major leagues. So in 1945, the mayor of New York City, Fiero LaGuardia, commissioned a study, and that study said that that's what should happen, not just that you should add Black ball players to these white teams, but that you should add Black teams to a white league. And that didn't happen, of course, but that would have been in some ways a better integration, because then you would have preserved some of the contracts and some of the investment of money. One of the things that Jackie Robinson was always kind of perturbed by his whole life was that the integration of baseball just happened on the labor level. It was just the ball players that were integrated. It was not the management. It was not the front office. It was not the ownership. And that was a pretty persistent theme throughout his whole life. Here's a protest that took place in New York City in the late 1940s by union workers. And this kind of symbolized that it was not just the Brooklyn Dodgers who decided to integrate baseball. There's actually substantial pressure from the grassroots, from labor organizations, particularly from communists. There's a number of communist officials who were in elective office in New York City that pressured baseball owners. The representatives, like the mayors of LaGuardia, also city councilmen in Boston, were pressuring baseball to integrate. The myth is often that it was just Jackie Robinson and the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, Branch Rickey, that integrated baseball, but that kind of ignores these leftist organizations that were at the forefront in pushing baseball to kind of change. Another group that deserves mention in that context would be African American writers and sports writers like Wendell Smith here, who actually helped mentor Jackie Robinson in his when he was minor league career, and then starting off in the major leagues. And actually, Ghost wrote a few columns for Jackie Robinson early in his career. But the sports writers were demanding the integration years before Jackie Robinson kind of had that opportunity. Jackie Robinson here is pictured in the Dominican Republic, and this was very common for ball players, not just Black ball players, but white ball players, to play throughout the winter in the Caribbean, to play in what they would call barnstorming events, where they would play again in the off season white teams versus black teams in cities. This is a way to kind of make some extra money for the cities to generate more revenue. So it was a lot of interaction in some ways across the color line well before the kind of the formal um, integration of baseball with Jackie Robinson in April 1947. One thing to note about Robinson as well is that he was a well-known athlete. He's probably a better football player than he was a baseball player. He played for, he went to college at UCLA, was an All-American, and played baseball, track and field, basketball, and football, but was really well known as a football star and nationally known. And then he went off to serve in World War II. And after that, he joined the Negro Leagues, the Kansas City Monarchs, for about a year before he was then signed to the Brooklyn Dodgers. He, of course, helped initiate a wave of African Americans to then join in Major League Baseball. Roy Campanella soon followed him on the left as the catcher for the Dodgers. Larry Doby was the first black man to play in the American League for the Cleveland Indians, and Don Newcomb, a great Dodger pitcher. Don Newcomb is the only one of those four that's not in the Hall of Fame. And so it shows in some ways the level of talent that was in the Negro Leagues and the African American community, as well as the way that playing baseball, a lot of black ball players saw this as an opportunity to prove the falsehood of white supremacy. I mean, this is something that Hank Aaron, who just died about a month ago, made explicit, is that he hit home runs to kind of show that black people were not inferior. And so that carried over kind of into the game itself. Jackie Robinson was very famous for his speed and athleticism. What he was perhaps most unique about him was stealing home plate, which he did here against Yogi Berra in the 1955 World Series, which is the first time that the Brooklyn Dodgers won the World Series, and only time they won the World Series. It's an incredibly difficult maneuver, if you know anything about baseball, to kind of beat the pitch to home plate. But Robinson was able to do this on more than one occasion. And in 1955, this is the year before he actually retired. So he's got some old legs there, but he still had the speed to kind of the best in the Yankees there in 1955. So he ends up his playing career in 1956. The Dodgers moved to Los Angeles in 1957. And the rest of Jackie's life often gets forgotten, but he was, what's interesting is how political Jackie Robinson was. And that political side of Robinson actually shows up a bit early. In 1949, he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was a explicitly anti-communist committee. This is where you have the Hollywood blacklist and so forth. And he was there to denounce the great black singer, actor, all-around Renaissance man, Paul Robeson, who was a communist, who had said that in 1948, he had said that black Americans would not fight against the Soviet Union. So Congress called Robinson, who at the time was only his second year in Major League Baseball. He was also in the middle of his MVP season. So this is July. He's playing baseball at the time. He was called before to denounce Robeson, and he kind of does that. But he, as you see from, well, you can't quite see maybe with the quote, but he actually uses it as an opportunity to denounce the racism that black people face in America. And this is one of the really powerful themes of Robinson's life, is that he used his status, he used his celebrity consistently to kind of attack and call out racism in America. That didn't make it into the papers. What most of the newspapers focus on is that he had criticized Paul Robeson and thus burnished America's anti-communist viewpoints. But Robinson continued to protest. Here he is in 1960 in Cleveland, joining a picket to protest against, in support of the sit-in movement, which is seen as the beginning of kind of the one of the beginnings of the Southern Civil Rights movement. He would go around and join forces with civil rights organizations, raise money for the NAACP, but he was not just interested in civil rights. Here he is campaigning for Richard Nixon in 1960 because Jackie Robinson was actually a Republican. And this was at a time where there was, you have liberal and conservative wings in both the Republican and the Democratic parties. And Richard Nixon was also Californian, so they had that in common. But the interesting thing also about Jackie Robinson is the way that he broke with Nixon. He ends up breaking with a lot of the Republicans as they don't actually pay enough attention in his mind to the issue of civil rights or for African Americans. And Robinson made this quite clear what his viewpoints were. He was given a weekly column in the New York Post and then later in the Amsterdam News. Amsterdam News was one of the largest circulation Black newspapers in America at the time. And he rarely wrote about sports. He wrote about politics of the day. He wrote about police brutality. He denounced the turn, especially after 1964, where Republicans get very conservative with the Goldwater nomination. And you know Goldwater, who was the nominee in 1964 for the Republican Party, famously did not vote in favor of the Civil Rights Act and denounced basically the civil rights movement. And even though Robinson still somewhat identified with the Republican Party, he could not let go that their move away from civil rights issues. He also famously got into a tuffle with Malcolm X. Here they're a little bit more happier time, but exchanged letters in the newspapers. Both were quite critical of each other. Jackie Robinson's always been a strong proponent of integration, and thus he didn't like Malcolm X's separatist viewpoints. And conversely, Malcolm X didn't like the way that Robinson kind of seemed to always having a white benefactor, but they ended up having a fair amount of respect for each other as well. It signifies the way that Robinson was heavily involved in the politics of the day. For him, there wasn't really that separation between sports and politics that I think we've been having conversations about in our own era. He joined with Martin Luther King Jr. in a series of protests and public speeches. He held fundraisers at his home in Connecticut. We bring in like great jazz artists and raise thousands of dollars. But he spent a lot of time on the road fundraising, a lot of time on the road helping out with these protests. And again, this is a pretty important aspect of his life. Up until the very end, he was given this honor in 1972, just before he died at the World Series by Major League Baseball, standing there with his wife. But even at that moment, he was denouncing the fact that baseball, while integrated, again, by the ball players, still had not had a Black manager. There was no Black men in the front office and certainly no Black owners in baseball. And he recognized that he had a place in baseball, but also used that to kind of denounce the continual levels of the color line. And then finally here, this is at his grave site where Jesse Jackson there, standing in the robes, was the one who gave his eulogy. Jesse Jackson, of course, was a great civil rights advocate, later became a politician himself, ran for president a couple times in the 1980s, and became quite close to Jackie Robinson at the end of Robinson's life. And that again just kind of showcases the way that Jackie Robinson was well attuned to the times and well integrated into really the civil rights movement. I mean, one way to kind of think about Jackie Robinson is to consider him as one of the beginnings, or maybe the beginning of the modern civil rights movement, not necessarily Brown versus Board of Education in 1955 or the Montgomery bus boycott in 1957, but Jackie Robinson is kind of integrating baseball. So that's the slide. So let me just run through a couple themes, three themes that I just want to emphasize that we kind of went over in the course. The first is that integration is not a moment, but a process. I think there's a way that we think about Robinson as he broke into baseball. When he stepped on the field, baseball's integrated, the work is done. But in fact, he actually faced all sorts of abuse attacks from other players, as well as being booed by the fans for all of his 10 years of playing baseball. It was a long process, and we shouldn't just think of baseball's integration as just the ball players. A second thing to consider is that segregation benefited the players as much, if not more, than the owners. I think we consider things like the color line as a manifestation of baseball ownership, but one of the things that we did in the course is we read about some of the origins of the color line. And really, the owners of these ball clubs were interested in talent because they wanted to sell tickets. And so they didn't actually have a particular opposition to keeping Black people out. It was, in fact, the white baseball players who would benefit from segregation, and they would have then less competition from other people of color. And then a third thing to kind of wrap the themes up is to think about Jackie Robinson as a sanitized figure, not unlike the way that we remember Martin Luther King Jr. These days, Major League Baseball has a day, a Jackie Robinson Day, and all the ball players wear 42, which was his number, on their uniforms, and it's a day to celebrate Robinson to integration. But that is also a way to kind of obscure his role in politics, to obscure his constant advocacy and agitation for, Black capital, for instance. He actually was a businessman for a while, actually helped us started a bank to try to give loans out to Black people because most of the white-owned banks would not do that in an effective way. And at the end of his life, he was not triumphal in the way that Major League Baseball portrays it. His autobiography, his last one, was called "I Have Never Made It." He was lamenting the fact that he was still just considered a Black man, still considered deficient by much of America. And this is something that we brought up in class a lot and made connections to Colin Kaepernick and kneeling before a national anthem. Jackie Robinson in that autobiography said, and I quote here, "I cannot stand and sing the anthem. I cannot salute the flag. I know that I am a Black man in a white world. In 1972 and 1947, at my birth in 1919, I know that I never had it made." So in the context of our own time about thinking about the role of sports, the role of racism, I think the life and legacy of Jackie Robinson offers some important critiques about how we discuss that there. So those are my themes. That's a little bit about Jackie Robinson. I will now turn over to Julia, who on the first day of class said that she'd be willing to join this presentation. And by the end of the class, also was still willing to join this presentation. So I really appreciate Julia's time here. So Julia, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Okay, hi, I'm Julia, obviously. I took this class because I'm from Brooklyn and well, I'm not white, so I thought, why not take a class on diversity? I think one of the most pressing things for me personally when I was taking this class was that I was the only person of color in the class. So I felt a little uncomfortable bringing up any sort of things people would say, especially in terms of race-related stuff. I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand experiences that people of color go through. And I obviously don't understand experiences that a Black man or a Black woman or a Latina woman or Latinx man or woman would go through. And so it's definitely a good number of awkward moments for me. And I'm pretty sure Dr. Behrend can agree. He saw me kind of just sat there with my mouth open like, oh, we're saying that today. Cool. But aside from that, I think it was a really great class for white students to take because I think it really does open up their eyes as well as people of color's eyes as to the reality of how integration of baseball really worked and how it really kind of failed in a number of ways, at least in my opinion. So as Dr. Behrend discussed earlier, we typically utilize sports or other forms of entertainment as a way to escape reality. And so that's why there was such a massive pushback against Jackie Robinson joining a major league team from both the players and management. And that's still why there's a massive pushback. When LeBron James made a statement about Black Lives Matter, this one news reporter said he needs to stay in his lane. And so it was kind of like, well, you know, like that's just another example of, you know, people trying to keep entertainment and reality completely separated. So I think that that's a key aspect that we discussed. I think in some ways he definitely is a hero, but I don't think he's a hero for baseball. I think he's more of a hero in terms of civil rights activism. Martin Luther King said he was like the sit-in before sit-ins, and you know, he was kind of the inspiration for the nonviolent movement, which I think kind of blows because you know, he wasn't able to fight back. He wasn't able to defend himself or stand up for himself when, you know, people would threaten his life, threaten his kids' lives, his wife's, you know, people would taunt him during games, like at his job, like that's his job. Like, come on, guys. So I think he was forced to be put in a non-violent and non-reactive position, regardless of, you know, maybe what he might have wanted to do. So I think he's commendable for that. But I think once he left baseball, that's when he really was able to be more of a hero, because he was able to, you know, speak for the NAACP and, you know, actually be vocal about Black rights and civil rights. Again, subjectivity of the color line. I feel like Dr. Behrend just kind of hit everything I was going to say, but no, it's okay. But subjectivity of the color line. Well, first off, they developed an international league in 1887, and they opened it actually with Black players. So it was between Canada and the US. And then also there was no actual legislation on banning Black or Latino players. It was just kind of up to management and up to what they thought the fans would want to watch. I think the one thing that I really, really wanted to learn more about had we had more time is the way that immigration really did just destroy Black communities. I mean, Negro League games, they would typically happen on a Sunday right after church. And so a lot of what would happen is they'd make it kind of like a picnic in the park after church. And so they would spend money on clothing, on food. It would be a time for enculturation, which is kind of like when you become more of a member of your community, and it boosts morale and whatnot. And so I think that by taking those few select Black players that they deemed as worthy enough, that aided in the destruction of Black communities and a feeling of togetherness. Yeah, that's kind of all I have to say. Sorry.
No, I think that's great. Thank you, Julia. So that's what we've got. That was our experience, and I wonder now we've got another 30 minutes here. This is okay, right, Becky? We could have a conversation and thoughts on you know, what Julie and I said, or maybe extending this question about what we can do to make the college more anti-racist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so participants, if you want to unmute yourself or raise your hand, feel free. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Eddie.
So thank you, Justin and Julia, for that. That's really great conversation beginning with. I have a comment and a question. You titled either your class or this virtual meeting with the word anti-racism. And I wonder if, in retrospect, that's as meaningful or pertinent when you think back about that, because the word anti-racism probably didn't exist back when Jackie Robinson was playing. You know, if you use Kennedy's definition of anti-racism today, what they were doing in integrating baseball and some of the other sports was not really an anti-racist act. It was almost, when you think about it, if Jackie Robinson didn't have the physicality that he had, he probably would not have gotten into baseball. It's his extraordinary physicality that got him in. And as you said, other parts of his life, his social life, his political life back then were horrible. I mean, he had to live in separate hotels and he had to be segregated otherwise. So I'm wondering if you think that's still an appropriate term, which is today's term, to apply back then.
Can I take?
Oh, go ahead, Julia.
I think it's a cliche, but you know, unless we learn about history and unless we learn about the past, we're bound to repeat it. And so I think by learning the ways in which Robinson had to deal with racism and the ways in which we failed at making his life easier and making him truly part of baseball and truly integrating baseball, we can then move forward. I think that's the idea of, at least that's the perspective I took by taking the classes. We're learning about racist pasts and problems with our history to make us more woke, I guess is the best term, and to be more aware of how we can then move forward.
Yeah, and to kind of pick up on what Julia's saying, I don't think there's anything wrong in using the term, even if Jackie Robinson never said what he did was anti-racist. You know, I think there's ways that we can use the language of our present to understand the past a little bit more explicitly. You know, it would be, I think, characterized more as you know, Robinson was fighting for civil rights, for instance, and that may fit more the time frame of the 40s and the 50s, even the 60s, but that also, I think, doesn't fully address what he was up against and what he was advocating for. He was pretty insistent that the country needed to end the predominant belief that white people are superior. Now he had fought, or he had served in the U.S. Army in a segregated unit. You know, that the palpable sense of the dehumanization that he faced was evident. I mean, the number of people think that one of the reasons why he died so young is because he dealt with the burden of fighting against racist beliefs and practices and policies continually, and that wore at him. And he was barely 50, but when he died in 1972. So I think it's anti-racism could work quite well in this context.
I see Paul has his hand up.
Okay, unmuted. First, thank you, Justin and Julia. That was great, and really appreciated the context that the overview of Jackie Robinson's career provided there. I wonder if there are any lessons to be learned about the possibilities and the limitations of allyship from Robinson's experience with his teammates on the Dodgers, and whether we learn anything from that experience also about the impact it has on someone to have you know, the direct encounter and contact with difference that his teammates had as a consequence of having him as a member of the team I don't know whether you explored that at all in the course, whether you did or not. If you have any thoughts about that, I would be really interested to hear.
You want to go ahead, Julia? Or I can go.
I mean, I'm formulating an idea, but I just want to ask, is that the Library of Congress as your background?
It's the New York Public Library.
Oh, nice. Okay, I just was wondering.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna formulate a thought and get back to you, build off what you say.
Okay.
You know, Jackie Robinson was one of his core beliefs was the idea of integration. So he did. He was constantly looking for allies, and he was looking for. To get back to his politics, he was always looking for kind of allies for people like him. Like he was an anti-communist and a businessman, and that's why he kind of gravitated to Republicans. And I don't know if it was more naivety on his part, but he kept getting burned by these Republicans. He actually worked for Nelson Rockefeller for a little while, but then had a falling out with him right before the Attica uprising, and we got to see more of like who Nelson Rockefeller really was. You know, he worked in business basically after he retired from baseball, and was always working with a lot of white investors or other corporate figures. So he didn't really want to, make these firm distinctions. He didn't take that separatist tone. He was critical of the Black Power movement, but on the other hand, Robinson was always someone who was willing to kind of question his assumptions in a way. Like even as he was critical of the way that the civil rights movement had morphed into Black Power, when the police attacked the Black Power protesters, he was critical of those police. Like he was defending those the Black Power advocates. So. I think there's an interesting humanity in Jackie Robinson for his politics, which seemed very confusing, at least to me, looking at it. But in his effort to try to find allies, he really wanted just both political parties, for instance, to treat Black people as citizens. It didn't seem like too much to ask. But that was kind of like the insistence on trying to work hard in some ways across the aisle and with other people. And the thing that really disenchanted him with the Democrats is because that was always the party of segregationists. So he can never fully bring himself around to being a Democrat either, because of that history. So that's his life and his politics just don't fit our partisan frameworks, but that I think can also be rather illuminating as we try to imagine a world that's not so defined by the liberals and conservatives. Julia.
Sorry, I just wanted to throw in something about like the role of an ally. Something I noticed a lot when you had us watch the films. So we watched Jackie Robinson's story, which is a semi-autobiography-ish. It's very Hollywoody. It's very like, there's a lot of like the cute little music bits in it. It's very cute. But we also watched 42, which I'm sure, or I'm hoping a lot of you guys have watched. It's a really good movie. I watched it in theaters with my dad. I was terrified of the Ben Chapman guy. Regardless, I felt a lot like people like Pee Wee Reese and Branch Rickey, which are two white Dodgers affiliation members. They were very much so turned into heroes and idolized because of their roles. Even when I was talking to my father about this class and talking to him about Jackie Robinson in general, he was like, oh yeah, Pee Wee Reese put his arm around him to show like racism like is bad. And I was like, that's not what happened. That wasn't the point. He was doing it to shove off his family, not for that. But that's not, I asked about Robinson, not about Pee Wee Reese. So I think that's a big thing. It's making sure that the voices you are trying to give light to and trying to raise up don't get overshadowed by voices and stories of the people that are still in a higher state of power. Sorry, I just wanted to throw that in.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that answer. Thank you both.
I think Ken had his hand up next, and then Crystal.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk, both of you. I'm going to go back to something that a point that Julia made in passing about LeBron James. And as we're looking at these photos of Jackie Robinson, that black and whiteness of the photography kind of tracks alongside kind of Martin Luther King histories of like, oh, those what that sort of civil rights were in the past. And so I have a couple of questions that are sort of related. One is, I guess I think of as kind of distinctive to baseball itself, that kind of Ken Burns, timelessness, eternal boys of summer kind of effect, right? That in black and white, we're in sort of this historical nowhere. And then secondly, then what kind of things would you do or did do with Jackie Robinson to bring that a little bit more into the racial politics of baseball today? I'll take my answer off the air.
I mean, one of the things we did to bring it into the politics of the day is that we read a book. Actually, it was a book of rhetoric. So I felt like I was branching into your and Paul's English realm a bit. Yes, that Julia's showing it there, which talks about, you know, the ways that the rhetoric around Jackie Robinson has distorted who he was and what he stood for. And it looked particularly about at the remembering of 42, but also the way he's portrayed in museums, and you know, just his kind of politics
I'm
there.
typing it. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
So and then the oh goodness, I lost. Yes. Becky's got that there. I lost my train of thought. Julie, help me out.
What were you saying? I was trying to type out the whole title.
What were you asking again, Ken?
Well, he asked about
Well, like bring also the kind of the twin things of baseball's kind of timelessness.
Oh yeah,
and innocence, I guess you could say, really. And then, okay, just to give you a kind of a concrete example, sometimes when I'm driving home from work, I'll have it on a sports station, and they'll have on some sort of quote unquote expert in fantasy baseball. And the way they talk about players and sort of owning teams and that sort of the kind of the discourse is really, really, to me, racially charged. It's like this kind of play acting of getting to be an owner, right? They'll talk very sort of self-uncritically about owning players and trading players, and this person's washed up, get rid of them. And it just seems like baseball is among the major sports, like right up there with football in terms of its slowness to change or its racial politics. And I'm just wondering like how you sort of get Jackie Robinson out of the past and into the present, into kind of a dialogue with current things that are going on in baseball.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna just say this. I friggin' love this book. It's so good. I have one major issue with it though. He compares a lot of modern athletes to Robinson, and I think that that's just not it's just not a okay comparison, because Robinson was the first to really just integrate sports in general. And so he's discussing someone like Colin Kaepernick, and yes, that was important that Colin Kaepernick did not stand for the national anthem, but it's not at the same level as what Robinson had to deal with.
Yeah.
What? Kayla's not home. Sorry. So
Here, I got
that
a
was-
couple points.
Okay, do you want to take over?
Yeah. So one of the things we did at the beginning of class is I would start as a kind of an icebreaker is to talk about sports in the news. So whenever we had our synchronous class sessions was, what do we talk about? And there's always something to kind of reference there. One of the times we discussed was Bill Belichick was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Trump, but refused to attend. So the point, one of the themes of the course is the way that sports and politics are actually quite blurred. And then in this course, since it was a 400 level history course, I had all the students write substantial research papers, and almost all of them did a topic related to sports and racism about, in some ways, the ways that others maybe pioneered integration or dealt with, in some ways, not just the color line, but sometimes the other lines around gender and sexuality that are in sports. So there are ways that through kind of student research, we were able to kind of get at the contemporary in a sense. And then also, I thought it was a good way that, one of the nice things about this course is to kind of use sport as a framework for us to get at some of these other issues. It allows us to kind of talk about some of these things in a different context. I think sports radio actually is a way to kind of talk about race. It's also a way to talk about and reinforce racism too. And so sports has this way of kind of getting at some of these issues about exploitation and about mistreatment. It's a different kind of language in our modern era. And so that was kind of one of the operating principles of how the whole course was operated. Julia.
I'm so sorry. Did you mention how we had the guest lecturer?
Oh, I didn't. You
Okay.
want to mention that?
Well, I was just going to say we had we read an article on statistics in baseball and the fact that it only really had white stats for X amount of time. And so the person that wrote the article, he came in and had a discussion with us. And so that was another way to tie in, more modern day aspects of the sport as well.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Adams. Sorry.
All right, Crystal.
Yeah, thank you, Justin and Julia. So I have a question, Justin, about the structure of the course and whether, again, given that we're thinking about becoming an anti-racist college, and this course was taught over Intersession, did you notice any shifts or any cognitive dissonance with students from the start of the course towards the end? So do you see how if students' beliefs and understandings of race and racism were challenged as a result of this course?
The overriding change I saw was just the struggle to keep up in a 4-week course. We read 5 monographs and had to write a film essay, and they each had to write like a 15-page paper, as well as discussion posts every day. So there was a bit of an exhaustion there. That was the overriding sentiment.
That was all of our reflection paper. We were all like, we barely kept up. Oh my God.
Yeah, I actually had them turn in a 15-page paper and then the next day write a 4 to 6 page reflection paper. But they all did it. They were wonderful. But there was a couple times, I don't know if you remember this, Julia, that there was this, in the Arnold Rampersad biography of Jackie Robinson, there's this one particular story that Branch Rickey, who was the owner of the Dodgers that brought in Jackie Robinson, told about how he had encountered racism or saw racism as a white man in the early 20th century. He'd been a college track athlete, and one of his friends was Black. And the story goes that the friend was one night just kind of obsessively washing his hands and trying to wash the color off of his hands. because of the constant mistreatment that he was facing. And his point was that if you could only erase the color, then things would be better. And there were a number of students that brought that up in their discussion posts as just a way to kind of not just understand racism, but in some ways maybe the suffering that kind of goes along with that.
I
and
think,
so
oh, sorry.
go ahead, Julia.
I was just going to say, I am friendly with a lot of a good number of the students from that class. And since it was a hell of a crap storm to hit us all in 4 weeks right before the semester started, we all were like texting like, oh my God, when is this due? So yeah, no, a lot of us, a few of us, actually not a lot, there's only like 4 of us that texted together, but we were always kind of like, yeah, this is pretty dark. And I was like, yeah, like, I mean, I wouldn't throw in my own antidotes, but I'd always feel, because I feel like it would be always awkward to just be like, yeah, I remember, you know, as a little kid in the middle of summer, I got real dark. My family's really white. And I once rubbed my skin raw in the bath. Like that wasn't, my mom was real mad at me. Like that's just something that like you do when you're not you always do, but something that sometimes happens when you're brought up in a culture and society that devalues you because of X, Y, and Z. And I think that definitely helped with to bring back up, oh gosh, Mr. Lee's point of anti-racism. It really sheds a light on the very vulnerable parts of an experience of someone who is dealing with racism, and makes people really see what's going on and how it feels to go through certain experiences.
See, Amanda Roth, you have your hand up.
Hi, Justin and Julia. Thanks very much for this. I was curious about, so this was, and I missed the first few minutes, so I apologize if you talked about this, but this is an advanced history course, right? So I was curious about thinking, like, in terms of the general curriculum and becoming an anti-racist college, do you have thoughts on how to get these courses that are focused on issues of race to students who might not be a history major, or, you know, how to do that across the curriculum, where like I find myself struggling with this. So how should we think about students might not have the disciplinary background, but might be interested in the topic and want to take an anti-racist course? So do you have thoughts about like expanding this or making any other versions of the course at different levels?
Yeah, we did talk a little bit about that, I asked the students for advice on whether I should teach this again, and if I should teach this over 16 weeks. And they were pretty positive about the idea of teaching it, but also recognized that maybe just to focus on Jackie Robinson may not be enough to sustain over 16 weeks, which I think is pretty accurate. But there seemed to be some interest in also thinking about sport and entertainment as a vehicle to kind of get at this. And maybe even expanding it. I mean, easily expand it beyond baseball. It doesn't have to be focused just on one particular sport. I certainly think there are ways to teach about anti-racism in all sorts of courses. I mean, so when I teach my 200 level general education course on the Civil War and Reconstruction, the role of African Americans is my main focus. And because it's about slavery and abolition and emancipation. And I think students may think that it's more of a course about wars and blue versus gray, but I try to quickly dispel that in how the syllabus is set up and the way the course is structured. So, you know, when I teach, you know, an INTD 105 class or a humanities class, American Studies class, I mean, these are the themes that I want to use really in all of my classes. So it's that's in some ways why, you know, I've been doing this a bit for a while, but I haven't called it anti-racism before, and so that's where I'm wondering what that in some ways, on its face, it seems like it's anti-racist because the subject matters deal with people who are opposing racism. But what does that actually mean as far as learning? What does that mean as far as the way the structure is set up, the conversations that I try to elicit from the students? I mean, I certainly think those are areas that I could work more on to try to provide a more inclusive opportunities for the course. Julia, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, could you potentially work with like the Black Studies minor or major? Because I think that would be very helpful. Like I thought this class should have been offered to Blacks, and I mentioned that I think to you during our class discussion. This should have been offered to Black Studies minors or majors, because I think that would have increased people of color enrollment, so I wouldn't have been the singular not white person there, and B, I think it just would have opened up the class, at least for if it's turns into a 16-week one.
Yeah.
And if maybe you bump it down to like a 200 level instead of 400.
Yeah.
Something like that. Just, generalize it a little bit more. Maybe don't tell them straight up that there's going to be a 15-page research paper.
I originally thought there would be capacity to reach out beyond history majors, but I mean, I think you're the only student, Julia, that was not a history major, although you're a minor. But I got so much interest in history majors that I really didn't try to reach beyond. But we do have the co-coordinator of Black Studies here, Kathy. I don't know if you want to say anything about dual enrollments or cross-listing or anything like that.
I think that would be a brilliant idea. But then again, we count all these courses. So any students who were Black Studies courses who would take any of Justin's courses, and certainly this one, we would count it. But actually, I had a question, if it's okay, if I can jump in. I don't know where I was in the line.
Yeah,
So
please
I
jump
don't
in,
have
Kathy.
this question formed too well, but I was thinking about, students, well, most of us have this kind of, we assign racism to a certain space and anti-racism to a certain space. And the extent to which things like baseball, again, they're traveling, they're on buses. Like you said, you could extend it also to musicians that do concerts. They're crossing those borders. So they're experiencing it in the North and in the South and in the East and in the West. And the extent to which that kind of like omnipresence of racism that follows you, regardless of which territory you're in or region you're in. Particularly, again, as historians fixed to a particular time, but, the extent to which that is something that maybe was an insight that this story and this person's life and experience helped to uncover. Did that make sense? I don't know.
And I think that was part of the one of the themes we did want to address, is that it's not a sectional issue. There's and also race is also not a binary. One of the first books we read actually looked at the Latino experience in baseball and how certain Latinos, as well as Native American people, Julia's got that there, were pushing the boundaries of the color line well before Jackie Robinson. And what Robinson did in some ways was make it possible for dark-skinned people of all different backgrounds to play baseball, not just African Americans. So yeah, the different kind of spaces of and different kind of lines that were there. I mean, tried to kind of historicize that a bit more and kind of add some complexity to that. And then we read a book also, since Julia is showcasing the books, the students didn't like as much, but it was about the Dodger Stadium and the way that the building.
Finally have all my stuff. It's great.
The way that the building of that stadium, as part of the process of Los Angeles becoming a modern city, but it had to do with the displacement of Mexican American families, as well as, contesting white suburbia and the use of public funds. And so, that's the thing, is that once you kind of pry that door open, and it's not just a matter of individuals being racist or not racist or good or bad, and you look at the policies and you look at the structures. And again, I think baseball was a really interesting, or sports is a really interesting vehicle to pry that open and to see those underlying patterns. We could get more in depth on the way that racism is perpetuated and how hard it is to root out.
I think also examining colorism, which is something that is not a new phenomenon, but it's something that definitely is being addressed more often. And like you mentioned, the soap thing, you know, I think it was Jackie Robinson Jr. who is in the bath and he was washing his hands and he was really upset that the dirt wasn't coming off. And he was like, I don't understand why I'm not light like mom now. And apparently his wife Rachel was very upset about that. And she was like, I don't know how to handle this. So I think that was a big aspect of, just another aspect of complexity.
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We are a few minutes over. Justin, Julia, are you able to take Eddie's last question before we wrap up here?
I do nothing with my day.
Okay.
Thanks. I was just going to follow up on what you said, Justin. I wonder if there was time in your limited class space to talk about either baseball or just sports in general as a metaphor for life. Because it seems like you just peeled the first layer of this. When you begin to get into sports, any particular sports, there's so many things that you can look at as metaphors for different aspects of life. Because even if you look across all different types of sports, you know, African Americans may have a large role in football and basketball, but they have much smaller roles in other sports. And some of that goes to availability of resources as kids. So there's a whole load of economic and political and sociological issues when you look at each sport or sport in general. So I wonder if maybe this is an opportunity to do some more teaching around this topic.
I mean, I definitely think, you know, I came to sports as more of a fan than as a scholar, and so I'm still kind of learning about what that means to you know, study sports. I did have students read some historiographical essays on the nature of sports history and the different types of ways that you can kind of approach and use sports to tell these other stories. But I think you're right that there's, you know, sports is kind of a mirror, and it's influenced by society. Society influences it. It's both a type of it's a business, it's entertainment, it's culture, it's a discourse. And in some ways, it became, once you see the realm of sports, it becomes kind of difficult to, you know, the grasp hold of it again. Like, I don't think I could ever teach a course on sports history. It's just too expansive. But it does, perhaps narrowly targeted, provide some opportunities to kind of discuss these other inequalities. And so I think to your last point about resources, I mean, Major League Baseball puts a lot of money into trying to attract more Black ball players. There's been a decline of African Americans in the last 20 years. And so the effort is into like funding creation of baseball fields in certain communities, which strikes me as just misguided because it's just not dealing with the structural inequalities that the reasons why there are not ball fields in the places where African Americans live, because that has to do with housing issues. Has to do with job issues. And so, you know, there's a way that by thinking about this as just a matter of individual effort that will achieve these anti-racist objectives, I think that that's kind of a misguided way to kind of look at the problems before us.
Great. Well, I wanted to take the time to thank our presenters again for their time and for your expertise. We want to thank our attendees as well for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoyed listening and hopefully you're able to take away something. that you can apply as you move forward in this journey toward anti-racism. Don't forget, this is the last week of our month-long series of events. I put in the chat, and I can do it again, the list of events remaining for Black History Month, and hopefully we will see you at those as well. Thank you so much again, Justin and Julia.
Thank you.
Thanks.